He was 12 years old when he lied about his age and walked into the recruiting office. Calvin Graham, a boy from Texas who would become the youngest American to serve in World War II. His childhood ended the moment he forged his mother's signature and convinced the Navy he was 17. The year was 1942. America was bleeding in the Pacific. Boys were becoming men overnight. But Calvin? He was still a child who shaved peach fuzz to look older, stood on his toes during the physical exam, and practiced deepening his voice in front of a mirror. He boarded the USS South Dakota with sailors twice his age. They called him Babyface. They had no idea how right they were. While other 12-year-olds were playing stickball in the streets, Calvin was loading anti-aircraft shells that weighed almost as much as he did. The Battle of Guadalcanal changed everything. Japanese planes screamed through the sky like metal demons. The ship shook with each explosion. Calvin manned his gun station as shrapnel tore through the air around him. Blood mixed with seawater on the deck. Men were dying. And somewhere in that chaos, a 12-year-old boy was fighting for his country. When the smoke cleared, Calvin lay wounded. Shrapnel had torn through his jaw and mouth. His dental records would later prove what everyone suspected, but no one wanted to admit. This hero was just a child who had seen more death in one night than most see in a lifetime. But Calvin wasn't alone in his deception. Across the oceans of World War II, Korea, and Vietnam, children slipped through the cracks of a system desperate for bodies. They forged documents. They memorized false birthdays. They practiced standing taller, speaking deeper, acting older. Some were running from poverty, others from broken homes, but many, they simply believed it was their duty. In the trenches of World War I, a 12-year-old British boy named Sidney Lewis served in the Battle of the Somme. When discovered, he had already survived one of the bloodiest battles in human history. His mother's frantic letters finally reached the War Office. They sent him home, but the damage was done. The boy who returned was not the boy who left. The Civil War holds even darker secrets. Historians estimate that over 20% of all soldiers were under 18, some as young as 9. Johnny Clem ran away from home at 9 years old to join the Union Army. By 10, he was a drummer boy. By 12, he had shot a Confederate colonel and become the youngest non-commissioned officer in Army history. They called him Johnny Shiloh. He carried a sawed-off musket modified for his small hands. These weren't isolated cases. They were symptoms of wars that devoured everything in their path, including childhoods, including innocence, including the very idea that some lines should never be crossed. Each war brought new methods of deception, better forgeries, more convincing lies, and always, the same haunting question that no one wanted to ask. How desperate must a nation be to look the other way when children marched to war? The recruiting stations knew. They had to know. When a boy with smooth cheeks and a cracking voice claimed to be 18, when his hands shook signing papers he could barely read, when he flinched at the sound of the door slamming. They knew. But quotas needed filling, wars needed fighting, and sometimes turning a blind eye was easier than turning a child away. In Vietnam, Dan Bullock became the youngest American serviceman killed in that war. He was 14 when he died. 14. He had altered his birth certificate, convinced his parents to sign consent forms, and shipped out to a war that would define a generation. On June 7, 1969, the Viet Cong overran his firebase. Dan fought. Dan died. Dan was still a child. His body came home in a flag-draped coffin. His mother collapsed at the funeral. She had believed he was safe in the reserves. She never knew her baby had volunteered for combat duty. The Marines quietly changed their verification procedures after Dan's death. Too late for him. Too late for so many others, but here's what the statistics don't capture. The weight of a rifle in hands too small to hold it properly. The way a helmet slides over eyes that haven't lost their childhood wonder. The sound of a young voice calling for mother in the darkness of a field hospital. These boys weren't just numbers. They were children playing at being soldiers until the playing became dying. Jack Lucas was 14 when he joined the Marines in 1942. He was 17 when he threw himself on 2 grenades at Iwo Jima to save his unit. Miraculously, he survived. The youngest Medal of Honor recipient in Marine Corps history spent months learning to walk again, years learning to live with what he'd done. Decades wondering if courage and childhood trauma were really so different. The stories multiply like shadows. Momcilo Gavrić, a Serbian boy who joined his army at 8 years old after his family was killed. By 10, he was a corporal. Sergei Aleshkov, 6 years old when he became the youngest Soviet soldier in World War II. His regiment adopted him after his family was executed. He carried messages through battlefields where grown men froze in terror. Each child soldier carried more than weapons. They carried the weight of adult decisions made with children's hearts. They carried the confusion of killing before they understood death. They carried the pride of serving and the shame of lying intertwined so tightly that even they couldn't separate them. The military had age limits for a reason. Combat changes people. It rewires brains, reshapes souls, leaves scars that never fully heal. Now imagine those changes happening to a mind still forming, a personality still developing, a child still becoming. The damage wasn't just physical, it was fundamental. Yet they kept coming. Wave after wave of children convinced that their youth was a small price to pay for glory, for escape, for belonging. They came from farms and cities, from wealth and poverty, from every corner of America, united only in their determination to be more than what their age allowed. The letters home told stories the official records never could, scrawled in pencil by hands that should have been holding schoolbooks, not rifles. "Dear Mama," they began, "I'm doing fine. The food is good. Don't worry about me." Lies wrapped in love, sent across oceans to protect parents from truths too heavy to share. Calvin Graham wrote to his mother from his hospital bed. He didn't tell her about the battle, didn't mention the shrapnel that had torn through his face, didn't describe the sound of sailors burning alive in oil-slicked water. He wrote about the dolphins he'd seen, about how the stars looked different in the South Pacific, about anything but the truth. When the Navy discovered Calvin's real age, they didn't treat him as a hero. They stripped him of his medals, threw him in the brig for 3 months, and gave him a dishonorable discharge. He had bled for his country at 12 years old, and his country responded by calling him a liar. It would take decades and an act of Congress to restore his honors. But Calvin's story reveals a darker truth about child soldiers. They weren't just fighting the enemy. They were fighting to maintain their deception, fighting to belong, fighting against their own bodies that betrayed them with cracking voices and sudden growth spurts. Every day brought new challenges: how to shave a beard that didn't exist, how to talk about girlfriends they'd never had, how to hide tears that came too easily. The psychological toll was devastating. These children witnessed horrors before they understood mortality. They killed before they understood morality. They made life and death decisions before their brains had developed the capacity for abstract reasoning. The frontal cortex, responsible for judgment and impulse control, doesn't fully develop until the mid-20s. These boys were making combat decisions with the neurological equipment of children. Dr. Sarah Matthews, who studied Vietnam-era child soldiers, documented a pattern. They came home unable to relate to peers who worried about homework while they carried memories of death. They struggled with survivor's guilt, amplified by the sense that they shouldn't have been there in the first place. They aged out of sync, ancient in experience, frozen in emotional development. One veteran who enlisted at 13 described it, "I came home at 16, but I was simultaneously 6 and 60. Part of me never left that battlefield. Part of me never got to grow up normally. I existed in this strange limbo where I'd seen too much to be young but was too young to process what I'd seen." The military eventually recognized this crisis. By World War II's end, verification procedures had tightened. By Vietnam, birth certificates were mandatory. By modern conflicts, sophisticated background checks made child enlistment nearly impossible. Nearly. Because where there's desperation, there's deception. And where there's war, there are always children who believe they're ready to fight it. But why? Why did they do it? The answers are as varied as the boys themselves, yet patterns emerge from their stories like smoke from battlefield fires. Some ran toward war to escape something worse at home. Others ran toward a romanticized vision of glory that recruiting posters promised but reality rarely delivered. Take the case of Joseph Argencio Jr., who enlisted in the Navy at 14 during World War II. His father had died, leaving 8 children and a widow drowning in poverty. Joseph saw military pay as salvation for his family. He memorized a fake birth date, practiced forging his mother's signature until it was perfect, and convinced a recruiting officer that his small stature was just late blooming. He sent his entire paycheck home every month. Or consider the story of David Waldron, who joined at 15 during Vietnam. His motivation was simpler and perhaps more heartbreaking. "My dad was a Marine in World War II," he later recalled. "I thought if I became a Marine too, maybe he'd finally be proud of me." David's father had returned from the Pacific a changed man, distant and cold. His son thought shared combat experience might bridge that gap. It didn't. It only created two damaged generations instead of one. The recruiting culture of wartime America played its part. Posters showed strong-jawed heroes liberating grateful populations. Movies glorified combat as the ultimate test of manhood. Communities celebrated their warriors with parades and prayers. For boys struggling with identity, with belonging, with purpose, the military offered all three wrapped in a uniform. Schools sometimes enabled the deception. In small towns where everyone knew everyone, principals and teachers occasionally provided false documentation. They saw it as patriotic duty. One teacher in rural Alabama admitted years later to changing grades on transcripts to age students up. "Those boys were going to find a way to enlist anyway," she rationalized. "At least this way they went with our blessing." The economic factor cannot be ignored. During the Depression and its aftermath, military service meant steady pay, 3 meals a day, and escape from grinding poverty. For orphans and runaways, it meant belonging somewhere. The military became a surrogate family for children who had none. That the price of admission was lying about their age seemed a small deception compared to the promise of stability. Peer pressure pushed others toward enlistment. When older brothers and friends marched off to war, younger boys felt left behind. They formed clubs, sharing tips on fooling recruiters. They practiced together, coached each other through interviews, celebrated successful deceptions like victories. In their minds, they weren't lying. They were proving themselves worthy. Regional culture mattered too. In the South, military tradition ran deep. Families traced service back generations. Boys grew up on stories of ancestor heroes, Confederate and Union alike. The expectation wasn't whether to serve, but when. For some, waiting until 18 felt like cowardice when younger boys had fought in every American war since the Revolution. The moment of truth came differently for each boy. For some, it was immediate. The first explosion, the first casualty, the first time they realized that war wasn't what the posters promised. For others, it crept up slowly, a gradual understanding that they had traded their childhood for something far darker than they'd imagined. Private First Class Dan Bullock understood in his final moments. As Viet Cong soldiers overran Firebase Thunderbolt, this 14-year-old boy from Brooklyn fought with the ferocity of someone twice his age. Witnesses described him manning his position even as others retreated, firing until his ammunition ran out. In those last seconds, was he a soldier or a child? Perhaps the tragedy is that he had to be both. The physical toll on these young bodies was severe. Military training pushes grown men to their limits. For boys still growing, still developing, the damage could be permanent. Stress fractures in bones not yet fully formed, spinal compression from carrying packs that weighed nearly as much as they did, malnutrition from combat rations their growing bodies couldn't sustain on. One medic from Korea recalled treating a wounded soldier who looked impossibly young. "I was cleaning shrapnel from his leg when I noticed he had baby teeth." Baby teeth. This kid still had baby teeth, and here he was, bleeding out on a hilltop in Korea. I reported it, but nothing came of it. We needed every man we could get. The psychological wounds ran deeper. These boys experienced what psychiatrists now recognize as moral injury. The deep psychological wound that results from actions that violate one's moral beliefs. But their moral frameworks were still forming. They were simultaneously developing and destroying their sense of right and wrong. Sleep became a battlefield of its own. Night terrors plagued child soldiers at higher rates than adult veterans. They'd wake screaming for mothers thousands of miles away. Tentmates learned to wake them gently, to speak softly, to never touch a sleeping child soldier suddenly. Too many had learned to kill before they were fully awake. Letters from commanding officers paint a complex picture. Many knew or suspected they had underage soldiers. Some protected them, assigning them to safer duties when possible. Others, hardened by war's necessities, treated them no differently than adult soldiers. One sergeant wrote, "He might be young, But bullets don't check birth certificates. If he's here, he fights like everyone else. The bonds formed between child soldiers and their units were intense. Older soldiers often became surrogate brothers, fathers even. They taught these boys to shave faces that didn't need it, to tie boots with hands that shook, to kill with hearts that weren't ready. These relationships were beautiful and terrible, lifelines in hell that came at the cost of innocence. Combat revealed truth in ways training never could. When the shooting started, age became both irrelevant and everything. Young soldiers often fought with desperate courage, as if proving their right to be there. But when wounded, when dying, the facade crumbled. They called for their mothers. They cried like the children they were. They died confused about why they had wanted this so badly. Coming home was supposed to be the happy ending. The bands would play, families would reunite, and heroes would return to grateful nations. For child soldiers, homecoming was often the beginning of a different kind of battle. They returned to worlds that no longer fit, carrying secrets that could destroy the fragile narratives of their service. Calvin Graham came home to disbelief and disgrace. When his sister saw newspaper coverage of the battle and recognized him, she contacted the Navy. Instead of protecting a child who had served with distinction, they prosecuted him for lying about his age. His mother, who had been receiving his allotment checks, was forced to repay them. The hero of Guadalcanal spent his 13th birthday in a military prison. The readjustment was brutal. These boys had to navigate adolescence while processing combat trauma. They attended high school with memories of killing. They went to prom with hands that had held dying friends. They tried to care about algebra while knowing how arterial blood looked in moonlight. The cognitive dissonance was overwhelming. Many hid their service entirely. They created elaborate lies about where they'd been, what they'd done. One Vietnam veteran who'd enlisted at 14 didn't tell his own children about his service until they were adults. How could I explain that I'd fought in a war before I could legally drive? How could I make them understand that I'd been so eager to throw away what they took for granted? The physical evidence was harder to hide. Scars that required explanation, injuries that limited participation in normal teenage activities. Growth stunted by malnutrition and stress. One boy returned from Korea having gained only 2 inches in height during 2 years that should have seen significant growth. Doctors theorized that combat stress had literally stopped his development. Relationships suffered profoundly. These veterans couldn't relate to peers worried about homework and dating. They gravitated toward older crowds or isolated entirely. Many dropped out of school, unable to sit in classrooms after commanding gun positions. The skills that kept them alive in combat, hypervigilance, aggression, emotional numbing, made them outcasts in civilian life. Some found refuge in veteran communities, but even there they were oddities. Adult veterans often didn't know how to treat them. Were they brothers in arms or children to be protected? The child soldiers existed in a liminal space, too experienced for childhood, too young for full acceptance in veteran circles. The legal battle stretched for decades. Many child soldiers had received dishonorable discharges for fraudulent enlistment. This barred them from veteran benefits just when they needed them most. They fought 2 wars, one overseas and one for recognition at home. Some, like Calvin Graham, eventually won. Others died waiting for acknowledgement that their service, however illegally begun, had been real. Families struggled too. Parents who had unknowingly signed false papers carried guilt. Siblings wondered why their brothers had been so desperate to leave. The homecoming photos, smiling boys in uniforms too big, surrounded by proud families, hid layers of deception and trauma that would take generations to unravel. The long shadow of their service followed them through decades. As boys became men, they carried their secret histories like shrapnel too deep to remove. Some thrived despite the trauma, building lives on foundations of hard-won resilience. Others crumbled, unable to reconcile who they'd been with who they were expected to become. Jack Lucas, the boy who threw himself on grenades at Iwo Jima, returned to high school at 17 with a Medal of Honor. Imagine sitting in history class, studying World War II while wearing the nation's highest military decoration. His classmates treated him like a curiosity, a hero, a freak. He dropped out within months, unable to pretend that normal teenage concerns mattered after what he'd seen. The patterns of struggle were consistent. Higher rates of divorce, difficulty maintaining employment, substance abuse as self-medication for untreated trauma. One study found that veterans who enlisted underage were twice as likely to experience homelessness later in life. The very traits that enabled them to deceive recruiters, independence, desperation, willingness to take risks, often led to instability in civilian life. But there were also stories of remarkable resilience. Dan Bullock's mother, devastated by her son's death, became an advocate for proper age verification in military recruiting. She transformed her grief into purpose, ensuring other mothers wouldn't lose children to wars they were too young to fight. Her work contributed to policy changes that made underage enlistment nearly impossible. Some child soldiers found healing through service of a different kind. They became teachers, counselors, advocates. They used their unique understanding of trauma to help others. One veteran who'd enlisted at 13 became a psychiatrist specializing in childhood trauma. "I couldn't save my own childhood," he explained, "but maybe I can help save others." The question of accountability haunted many. Who was responsible? The boys who lied? The recruiters who looked the other way? The systems that created such desperation? The wars that demanded such sacrifice? There were no clean answers, only the messy reality of children thrust into adult consequences. As they aged, many child soldiers began sharing their stories. Oral history projects captured testimonies that official records had missed or suppressed. These narratives revealed the human cost of war in ways statistics never could. They spoke of friends who died before learning to drive, of killing enemies who looked as young as they were, of growing old while parts of them remained forever frozen at the age they'd enlisted. The physical toll accumulated over decades. Injuries sustained by growing bodies manifested in chronic pain, early arthritis, cognitive issues from untreated concussions. The VA struggled to provide appropriate care for injuries that predated official service records. Many child soldiers fought bureaucratic battles into their 70s and 80s, still trying to prove that their service had been real. Family legacies complicated healing. Sons of child soldiers often felt pressure to serve, to prove themselves worthy of fathers who'd done so much so young. Some families developed traditions of early enlistment, each generation lying to follow the previous one's footsteps. The cycle continued until records became too difficult to falsify, leaving a final generation unable to maintain the tradition. The reckoning came slowly, then all at once. As America grappled with the true costs of its wars, the stories of child soldiers could no longer be ignored. Museums began including their narratives. Historians acknowledged what had long been whispered. The comfortable myth of wars fought only by adults crumbled under the weight of evidence. Congress occasionally acted. Laws were passed recognizing specific child soldiers, restoring benefits, acknowledging service. But these were individual victories in a larger war for recognition. For every Calvin Graham who eventually received his Purple Heart, dozens died unacknowledged, their service records forever marked by the lie that had enabled them to serve. The military itself evolved. By the Gulf War, age verification had become sophisticated. By Afghanistan and Iraq, the days of 14-year-olds slipping through were essentially over. But in developing nations where America fought proxy wars, child soldiers remained a reality. American forces found themselves facing enemies as young as their own hidden history. This created a moral complexity few were prepared for. Veterans who had themselves served underage struggled with rules of engagement regarding young combatants. One Marine in Afghanistan, who'd enlisted at 15 during Vietnam, broke down after a firefight involving teenage Taliban fighters. "I saw myself in them," he wept. Young, convinced they were doing right, throwing their lives away for old men's wars. The intersection of American child soldiers and international humanitarian law raised uncomfortable questions. How could America condemn the use of child soldiers globally while honoring its own? The cognitive dissonance required careful navigation. Officials distinguished between voluntary enlistment and forced conscription, between past practices and current standards, between necessity and exploitation. Educational curricula slowly adapted. Some textbooks began mentioning the prevalence of underage soldiers in American conflicts. Teachers grappled with how to present this information. How do you tell students that children their age fought and died in every American war? How do you balance historical accuracy with the need to discourage emulation? Veterans organizations faced their own reckonings. Should they accept members who'd enlisted underage? How should they handle benefits claims from soldiers whose service began with fraud? Many chose compassion over regulation, recognizing that these veterans had sacrificed regardless of their age at enlistment. The media treatment evolved from sensation to sensitivity. Early coverage focused on the novelty, boy hero headlines that glamorized what should have been tragedy. Later, journalism dug deeper, exploring the systemic failures that enabled child enlistment and the lasting damage it caused. Documentaries gave faces and voices to statistics. The final accounting may never be complete. How many children fought in America's wars? Thousands, certainly. Tens of thousands, probably. The exact number is lost in a haze of destroyed records, successful deceptions, and willful blindness. Each war brought its own wave of young volunteers, and each generation kept its secrets. What remains are the lessons written in scars and silence. The understanding that desperation and patriotism can drive children to attempt the impossible, that systems designed to protect can fail when overwhelmed by need, that the line between courage and tragedy is often drawn by age. Modern child soldiers, those who served underage in recent conflicts, face unique challenges. Their service is better documented but often more controversial. They served in wars without clear victories, returning to a nation divided about their missions. The pride that sustained earlier generations of child soldiers is complicated by questions about what they fought for. Technology has made their stories harder to hide, but also easier to share. Online communities connect veterans who enlisted underage, providing support that previous generations never had. They share coping strategies, legal advice, and the simple acknowledgement that they're not alone in their experience. The psychological understanding has deepened. We now know that trauma experienced during developmental years affects the brain differently than adult trauma. Treatments have evolved to address the specific needs of those who experienced combat before their brains fully developed. But knowledge isn't healing, and many still suffer in silence. Some find meaning in prevention. They work with at-risk youth, recognizing the signs of desperation that once drove them to recruiting offices. They advocate for better support systems, addressing the root causes that make military service seem like the only escape. They tell their stories not as adventures, but as cautionary tales. The broader implications ripple outward. Every child soldier represents a failure of family, community, or nation to provide alternatives. Their service indicts systems that create such desperation, their survival testament to resilience that should never have been necessary. As the last World War II child soldiers pass away, their stories risk being lost. Archives work frantically to capture final testimonies. Families donate letters and photographs. The race against time feels especially poignant given how young these veterans were when they served. Men in their 90s describing decisions they made at 12, still trying to understand why they were so eager to grow up. In the end, what do we do with these stories? How do we honor service that began with deception, while acknowledging the tragedy of childhood sacrifice to war? The answer lies not in judgment, but in understanding. These were children caught in the machinery of history, making choices no child should face. Calvin Graham died in 1992, his benefits only partially restored. He spent his final years fighting for recognition not just for himself, but for all who served too young. His gravestone reads simply, Calvin Graham, Seaman First Class, U.S. Navy, World War II. No mention of his age, no acknowledgement of the boy who fought at Guadalcanal, just another veteran among millions. But his story, and the stories of thousands like him, demand more than silent graves. They demand recognition that war's appetite extends beyond adults, that desperation and duty can drive children to extraordinary and terrible acts. They demand systems that protect the vulnerable while honoring their sacrifice. Today, somewhere, a young person considers lying about their age to enlist. The reasons haven't changed: poverty, patriotism, escape, belonging. What has changed is our ability to prevent it. But prevention requires addressing the underlying desperation that makes such choices seem reasonable. These stories matter because they're not just history. They're warnings. Every child soldier represents a societal failure to provide alternatives, support, hope. Their courage shouldn't blind us to the tragedy of its necessity. Their sacrifice shouldn't excuse the systems that enabled it. The legacy of America's child soldiers is written in policy changes, support systems, and the hard-won knowledge that some prices are too high to pay. It's carried by veterans who still wake to nightmares of battles fought before they could vote. It's preserved by families who learned too late what their children had done. War ages everyone it touches, but it steals something irreplaceable from children. The boys who lied their way into America's conflicts gave more than their service. They gave their innocence, their development, their chance at normal lives. Some found redemption in survival and purpose. Others never recovered what they'd lost. Perhaps the greatest honor we can give them is to ensure their stories prevent future repetitions, to build societies where children don't see war as escape or opportunity, to create support systems that catch the desperate before they fall, to remember that behind every child soldier was a child who deserved better. Their stories remind us that courage and tragedy often wear the same uniform, that heroism and horror can exist in the same moment, that children are capable of extraordinary acts when ordinary life fails them. These boys who went to war challenge us to build a world where such courage is never again necessary. Remember them not as heroes or victims, but as children caught in circumstances no child should face. Share their stories not to glorify but to prevent. Honor their service while condemning the necessity of it, and always remember that when we send our children to war, we've already lost something precious that no victory can restore. Like the video, subscribe, and share your thoughts below. Tell us about the young veterans in your family, the stories passed down through generations. This channel is for those who believe history is made not only by armies, but by individual courage, no matter how young the heart that carries.